In today's episode of the podcast, what's the deal with acrylic yarn? Why would you knit with it? What is it good for? And maybe a few pros and cons of knitting with acrylic yarn. And after that, a little brief tidbit about why your superwash merino wool sweaters are staticky. All of that right now on today's little ramble of a podcast. So get cozy and let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Knitting Podcast. My name is Tayler, and I will be your host. I am so happy to be here with you guys today. I have a very hot cup of tea here ready to go. It's actually so hot that I can't take a drink out of it. And I have a couple of questions that were submitted by viewers over at the Wool Needles Hands tip line at woolneedleshands.com. That's a place where you can leave questions for me to answer here on the channel, most often in the midweek ramble, but sometimes in the podcast episodes themselves as well. I chose two today because I felt like they were questions I could answer in a short amount of time, and they were both somewhat similar, I guess you could say, and they both have to do with yarn, which is the medium of choice for all of us knitters, crocheters, and fiber enthusiasts. These questions I know will be shared by folks out there, or at least once you hear the question, you may say to yourself, interesting, I never would have thought to ask that, but I'm interested to know the answer. So I hope that I can shed some light on both of these questions and provide you with a little bit more insight into yarn in general. And in the case of today's video, acrylic yarn and superwash yarn to be specific. Now, I know, a lot of you faithful viewers of the podcast are thinking to yourself, Tayler, where's your sweater? Where are your knitting projects? Don't worry, they're coming. We just need to be patient with Tayler right now. She's going through a little bit of a slump, but she will be back. But I always enjoy coming here and just sharing some really fun knitting topics with you guys and having my opportunity to sit and chat. And being able to do it every week with you guys is really special. So don't worry, those projects are coming. But let's go ahead and get into this. I want to read the question that was submitted by this first viewer first, and we're going to dive down that rabbit hole for just a little bit, and then we'll go to the second question. Okay, I have my computer right here. It's just a little bit easier for me. So the first question was submitted by a viewer, and it says, please, would you address knitting with acrylic yarn? Besides price, why would you knit with it? What's it good for? Is it okay when blended with something? Explain the pros and cons of acrylic. Now, I could take an entire 30-minute episode and talk about this. However, I want to just keep this a little bit more simplified, a little bit easier to swallow, because this is a really deep rabbit hole that we could go down for several episodes in an entire series on acrylic yarn. But for the sake of answering this question, and like I said, in small manageable chunks, I'm going to scrape the surface of acrylic yarn and the pros and cons. Again, we're keeping it brief. Now, before I dive into this, I do want to mention a few things. The viewers of the Wool Needles Hands channel are multifaceted, many, and very diverse. Some of us use acrylic yarn exclusively, some of us choose not to use acrylic yarn at all, and everybody has their reasons why they make those decisions and their choices. The choices that they make in the yarn that they use is up to them. It is not up to anybody here to dive down into the comments section and make anybody feel less than for their choice to use either acrylic or superwash wool. So if you would like to participate in the comment section down below, I really encourage that you do. However, always remember, be kind above anything else, and understand that people are coming at this craft from all different perspectives, and it's really important not to make somebody feel less than for what yarn they choose to use to bolster their craft. Okay, all of that said, let's go ahead and dive into acrylic yarn. What do we use it for? Why are we using it? What are some of the pros and cons? Now, if you'd like to know more about what acrylic yarn is, how it's produced, all of this, you can definitely do a quick Google search of what is acrylic yarn or how is acrylic yarn made. But for the sake of today's video, just know that acrylic yarn is a synthetic yarn that is produced with fibers made from petroleum-based materials. It is synthetic through and through. There is no natural component to a 100% acrylic yarn, so it is called synthetic. In terms of what you can make with acrylic yarn, you're really not very limited. You can knit pretty much anything with acrylic yarn that you would knit with a natural wool yarn. You follow the same guidelines when it comes to choosing the weight of the yarn for the project that you're making, but overall, there's really nothing that you can knit with 100% wool yarn that you cannot knit with acrylic yarn. Acrylic yarn really does serve as a great substitute for 100% wool yarns or other natural fibered yarns. Let's go go ahead and dive into the pros. The first one is going to be affordability. Acrylic yarn is generally more budget friendly than natural fibers, making it accessible to a wider variety of crafters. In addition to affordability, acrylic yarn is quite durable. Because it is made with a petroleum-based fiber, you're really using the power of plastic here to add durability to the yarn. A lot of people will say that acrylic yarn is just plastic yarn, and I feel like it's a little bit more complicated than that. However, you do have that durability of a synthetic fiber, similar to a synthetic fiber like nylon. It is just a lot stronger. Now, the yarn itself and the individual fibers itself are stronger. Fabrics that are knit with these yarns will tend to be stronger to an extent. However, one of the cons, and I'm just going to go ahead and tack this on early, is that acrylic yarn has a very serious propensity for pilling. Those are those little tiny nodules that you get on your knits that kind of are really unsightly in certain fabrics, and really in all fabrics. Acrylic is really prone to that. Now, there are lots of natural yarns and fibers that are also equally as prone to pilling as acrylic. It's just that acrylic is also really prone to pilling. You don't really escape pilling by using acrylic. So even though it's quite durable, it is very prone to pilling. Another pro of using acrylic is that it is hypoallergenic. Because it is produced with synthetic fibers, it does not use animal fibers, making it suitable for individuals with wool allergies, lanolin allergies, or just natural fiber sensitivities in general. Acrylic yarn is also really low maintenance and easy to care for. You can wash it in a washing machine and dry it in a dryer. You don't have to be too precious with it. It's just going to hold up. Now, when I say it's going to hold up, I mean that you're not going to just immediately damage it by washing it and drying it. However, it is clothing that is made with fibers, and over time, these things do deteriorate. Acrylic is not going to deteriorate as quickly as some other fibers. It is going to break down in the wash a little bit, and that does carry some environmental implications that you could look into further. If you would like to know more about that, you could Google acrylic fabrics and microplastics if you want to know a little bit more about what kinds of discussions are going on around synthetic clothing. However, overall, it is really easy to care for and relatively low maintenance. Acrylic yarn tends to be a lot lighter in weight compared to its natural wool or animal fiber counterpart. So if you're working with a worsted weight yarn in acrylic and a worsted weight yarn that is a 100% wool of the same yardage or meterage, typically the acrylic yarn will be of lighter weight. So it's a great choice if you're going to be knitting something larger that you don't want to be overly heavy. Acrylic yarn is also widely available. So it's affordable and it's available, meaning it is there for you if you want to break into crafting and get started right away, and you want to be able to find some really beautiful colors to work with right off the bat. Now, you can find acrylic yarn in any major crafting retailer, and even some local yarn stores will carry acrylic yarn. It is pretty much everywhere in terms of craft supplies. So it's available to you. And if you're ready to get into knitting or crochet or any kind of fiber craft, it's a really great place to start because you know you're going to be able to find it. Now, those are some reasons why you might want to use acrylic yarn, but here are some drawbacks to knitting with acrylic yarn. The first thing, and the thing that is most noticeable to me when I wear something that is made with acrylic, or if I've knit something with acrylic in the past, is it really lacks breathability. Because the fiber is synthetic and the individual strands of that fiber are pretty much impermeable, you're not going to get a lot of airflow through the garment. And when you knit with an acrylic fiber that is a petroleum-based fiber, if we want to use the word plastic based here just to give you a little bit of a better visual, we can, and you have this woven fabric up against your skin, you can kind of imagine how that would lack breathability compared to natural fibers. So one of the reasons why I might avoid acrylic yarn in a particular instance is because it lacks that breathability that you would really come to appreciate with natural fibers. Another reason why acrylic yarn may not be the best choice is because it's really not very stretchy or resilient. It is far less stretchy than its wool counterpart, meaning that if you're going to knit something that requires some drape or resiliency or a snapback or what have you, acrylic yarn may not be the best option. However, in comparison to other alternatives to wool that you might want to use, acrylic yarn is really going to give you the closest to wool available. So even though it may not have a lot of that stretch that wool has, it's really going to get you the closest to wool in terms of synthetic yarns. But overall, generally speaking, it's not the stretchiest. It's not the most resilient. Another con of acrylic yarn is it can generate a lot of static electricity. Because we're dealing with a synthetic fiber, there's not a lot of moisture that is retained in the fiber, not a lot getting in the way of pieces and strands rubbing together and just creating pure unadulterated static. So anytime you bring a petroleum-based fiber or a synthetic fiber into the mix, you're going to increase the chances of static. Now, with that, I think instead of mentioning the second question that I told you I had today, I want to insert it right here because it's somewhat relevant. So I'm going to skip over here to the second question that was asked. It says, "Hi, I'm watching your channel all the way from Denmark and I enjoy all of your insights and ramblings. I've spent the last couple of years knitting up an entire new collection of sweaters in 100% wool, as I found that I get static electricity buildup with even the slightest acrylic content in the yarn, causing me to get zapped by everything at work." That makes perfect sense. "I've even gotten into hand dyeing some yarn just for myself and just for fun. I bought some 100% merino wool and only after having dyed it realized that it was superwash. After knitting up the sweater, I find that the sweater gets crazy static buildup to the point where I just don't feel like using it at all. Is this a thing I should be aware of with superwash yarns, and is there anything that can be done to avoid it? Thank you, and I look forward to your videos regardless of whether this is a topic you would like to talk about or not." This is a great question, and I'm kind of fitting it in here with my question about acrylic yarn and the cons of using acrylic yarn being static electricity. The reason why, and yes, superwash yarn is more staticky than natural 100% untreated wool yarn because it has a polymer coating along the outside of the individual fibers. You're incorporating a plastic-based material or a polymer-based material, synthetic, to the outside of the natural fiber. If you would like to hear me talk more about this, I have a video all about superwash yarn. I will link to it down below and you get the whole scoop on that. However, that synthetic nature, or the small synthetic nature of superwash merino yarn is definitely going to lend itself to static electricity. Now, this also is going to be impacted by how dry of an environment this yarn is in. If you live in a very dry climate, that's only going to contribute to static. If it tends to be windy, it's going to contribute to static. There's lots of environmental factors as well. But generally speaking, when you're dealing with a synthetic fiber, you're really dealing with something that's not very good at mitigating static issues. So if it's staticky just in the air generally, your synthetic sweater or superwash merino sweater isn't going to be very good at mitigating that problem. Now, you can't talk about the cons of a synthetic-based yarn or an acrylic yarn without discussing the environmental impact of acrylic yarn. Now, this is a very complicated topic of discussion, and there's a lot involved in this discussion. It's not black and white. It is not plain and simple. However, acrylic yarn is a petroleum-based product, and we do have an understanding of petroleum-based products and their impact on the environment. You could say that acrylic yarn is similar to plastic and that it impacts the environment in much the same way as plastic does. And then there's another discussion about the microplastics that are produced from laundering acrylic or synthetic clothing. If you would like to know more about that, a simple Google search is definitely going to do the trick, and you can learn all about acrylic yarn and its environmental impact. I will tell you, however, that sometimes the impact on the environment, or I will say the benefit of using acrylic because of its availability and its affordability, may for individual people outweigh its impact on the environment. Depending on how it's being used and the quantity that it's being used. So honestly, you really have to think, what is your primary concern and what is your priority? Is it affordability and availability? Is that really what's kind of making the craft available to you or accessible to you? Perhaps the environmental impact of using acrylic yarn to knit a sweater for yourself just isn't a priority, and you make those decisions yourself, and whatever decision you make is your business and your business alone. However, it is always going to come up when you look up the pros and cons of using a synthetic fiber or purchasing synthetic clothing or anything like that, that it carries an environmental there's environmental implications. It's going to impact the environment. There isn't anything that we do on this earth that doesn't impact the environment. If you would like to know more about exactly what kind of impact we're talking about here, do a Google search. Type it into Google. I could create, like I said, an entire series of this. And I do gradually drop videos in that talk about these things from time to time. But it is important to know anytime you're using something synthetic that it carries some kind of an environmental implication or impact. And you just have to decide if the benefits for you outweigh any of those negative impacts. Another con when it comes to using acrylic yarn, especially if you're knitting clothing, is that it is simply less insulating than wool yarn. It's not going to retain a lot of heat like wool yarn does. It doesn't hold on to moisture and wick it away from your skin, which makes it much more weather friendly and kind of all season wear. It just doesn't insulate like wool insulates, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't insulate, period. It just means it's not as great at insulating like a natural fiber yarn would be. If you knit a sweater with acrylic yarn and you wear it in the wintertime, it's going to keep you warmer than if you were to wear, a t-shirt, but it's just not going to insulate you as much as the same sweater knit with a 100% wool yarn. And if you go into knitting your sweater acknowledging that and understanding that, it really doesn't matter. But if you live in a really cold climate and you need to make sure that your knits keep you very warm, chances are you probably want to be using natural fibers because it's just going to do a better job of that. But all in all, acrylic is just less insulating than a natural wool yarn. Last but not least, acrylic yarn just doesn't have a lot of textural variety. One acrylic yarn is pretty much going to feel, in terms of texture, the same as another acrylic yarn. There's not a lot of personality or character between acrylic yarns. Now, they are doing a lot with acrylic yarns these days, far more than they were doing 20 or 30 years ago. However, there's still just a very limited variation between texture of, two different acrylic yarns. So it's just something to consider. When it comes to purchasing acrylic yarn for a project, your choices and why you purchase one over another is probably not going to have a lot to do with the character and texture of the yarn. It's going to have a lot more to do with maybe how soft it is and the color and the weight and all of that. But when it comes to the character of the yarn, you just don't have that kind of experience like you do when you're dealing with a natural fiber yarn that can be very different in terms of character and textural variation between different types of yarn. So something to consider. It just doesn't carry that unique textural variation like natural yarn does. Ultimately, and at the end of the day, the choice to use acrylic yarn or natural yarn is up to the crafter. It depends on your specific needs for your project, your budgetary restrictions, personal preferences regarding texture, breathability, durability, and environmental implications. You have the choice to knit with whatever yarn is available to you in your yarn market. And you should feel confident and comfortable making those choices without worrying about judgment from others. Here at the Wool Needles Hands YouTube channel, we knit with all kinds of yarns: synthetic, natural, cheap, expensive. It's all happening in this channel. And we welcome folks who knit with all types of yarn here in this space. So whether or not you decide to knit with acrylic yarn or you decide to knit exclusively with natural fibers, it's all good, especially if it helps build up and bolster your creativity and contributes to the joy you have for this beautiful craft. That's all I have to share with you guys today. I loved those two questions. I thought that they were great questions in general, but I know that they're questions that some folks have that maybe are afraid to ask, or they don't think to ask, but really appreciate the information when it comes. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share that with you guys. If you took value from today's video or enjoyed yourself at any point, please don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Definitely subscribe and click that bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload new content here on the channel, which is every Wednesday and every Sunday. I will see you guys on Wednesday's episode of the Midweek Ramble. Until then, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.